Hi everyone, and a warm welcome to today's webinar, Perspectives from a National Sports Federation from Theory to Practice. Today's speaker is David Hanley. He is coordinator for inclusion in one of the regional organizations within Swedish sports. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A box or raise your hand after the presentation. David, the screen is yours.
Thanks, Sarah. Me and Sarah have got to know each other through Swedish, so it's lovely to hear her slightly Scottish accent when she's speaking English. You'll also notice my Irish accent and my name. I'm not from Sweden originally, I'm from Ireland. I've been living here for 10 years. As Sarah said, I'm going to speak a little bit today about how we work from theory to practice, but also how we work nationally to locally. I'll explain the context within which I work. As Sarah mentioned, I work for one of our regions within the National Sports Federation. So I'm not a researcher, not an academic, very much a practitioner, although I am a sociologist through my educational background. I spent 5 years then working with rugby, which is quite small here in Sweden, but I hear there may be participants from Canada and Scotland, so you'll know rugby well, or better perhaps than a lot of my Swedish colleagues here. Been working, as Sarah mentioned, as coordinator for inclusion here locally in Värmland for the last 5.5 years, and there's been a lot of changes for us during that time. So as Sarah said, if you get questions at any stage, please feel free to write them in the chat, and Sarah can help me stop and answer them if we need to at any stage. So let me just share my screen. So, as I said, some perspectives on our inclusion policy here in Sweden, and I'll go from the national to the local, and also a little bit of theory to how we put that into practice. My hopes for the session, firstly, that you hopefully get a bit of an understanding for a background and the context to how we work with inclusion here in Swedish sport, and then our role locally here or regionally. We're an extended arm of the National Sports Federation. I'll also just explain a little bit about kind of the unique conditions of Swedish sport as an organization, because I think it's quite important in this context. Hopefully then you'll also get kind of an overview of how we apply some of the learnings we've had over the last 5.5 years into our practice, and how we hopefully are continually learning and developing as we go along. And then I'll also address some of the short and long-term challenges we see locally, and kind of touch on some of those challenges nationally. As I said, we operate in a kind of a complex context. A metaphor to kind of understand what the Swedish Sports Federation is and what I do locally is really actually just, if you imagine a very simple kind of social democratic system. So you've got like a local town, or lots of local towns with their elected representatives, which then send their locally elected representatives forward, and some of them will work nationally. And then the national executive then appoints staff to deliver an agreed upon policy. Now, that's kind of exactly how the Swedish sport works. So as opposed to a kind of a more traditional model where government policy and funding goes directly to a government-funded organization, and that's how the Sports Federation act as a policy maker. That's not been the case in Swedish sport. So Swedish sport's been around for very, very long time, and it started very much as this kind of bottom-up organization. So that idea of the clusters of sports clubs that then began to organize democratically, who then created an umbrella organization up top, which is the National Sports Federation, which then created districts or regional staff, and almost you can imagine it like a regional council to implement the policy that the members decided on from the beginning. So we have our clubs, and then we have that kind of the national governing bodies. So we'll have a local curling club, and then we'll have in some cases a regional association of curling clubs, and then we'll have the National Curling Federation, which sits as one of 70 member unions under this umbrella organization, the National Sports Federation. So all our sports are there and organized in that way, very much from the beginning, from a bottom-up approach. And Swedish sport then, this umbrella, which is composed of these 70 different sports, then implement an agreed policy, which is agreed every second year at a national meeting of the 70 different sports, and help implement that locally and support locally. So I work for one of these, so from Swedish Sport, that umbrella of the 70 different unions, I work in one of 19 regions that Swedish Sport has chosen to implement and support the policy locally with. So my role would be to kind of close that loop and support the member clubs on the grassroots that are part of and own and drive us as a members organization. Now that's interesting, because when we then get up to the top and that there's a national umbrella, a national federation composed of the 70 member unions, we also started getting government funding. And from the beginning, the idea was that Swedish National Sports Federation would act in the members' interests, so the interests of these 70 members, and in turn the interests of their member clubs. So hopefully curling will represent the curling clubs' wishes in a democratic process, and likewise then along with 69 other sports, their interests are also met and then supported by us. So my job is to really support the wishes, democratic wishes from bottom-up perspective of the clubs. However, already we have a kind of an inherent conflict in that, is that when we get government funding, public health is part of that agreement. So, and we can see little clashes where, for example, Swedish football want to play football, they want to put teams out, they want to be successful nationally and internationally. But as a support organization, we also have to be cognizant of the fact that the government gives us certain criteria to work with in terms of our funding and so on. And this has become really apparent over the last 5 years, particularly when it came to the situation with refugees and immigration in Sweden in the period between 2015 and mainly 2018. So here's what I try to just describe in a metaphor in black and white. So I put a ring around the district federation where I'm one. I work in one of our 19. And then down the bottom, at the very bottom, you'll see these members. We've got 3 million, a population of 10 million in Sweden, and almost a third of that population is a member of one of our sports clubs, one of our 20,000 sports clubs. And a member can be an active member who's an athlete themselves, or a parent member, a coach, whatever it might be. Well, we kind of pride ourselves on the idea of the voluntary hours that our members put in year on year. It's entirely almost entirely on a voluntary basis, although we see that has changed somewhat. So you see quite clearly this idea of the bottom up, from our members to our clubs to the 72 special federations to then the confederation, and then how we then choose to support and administrate different policies throughout. So in 2015, in our region here in Värmland, we've got a population of just over 200,000, and some of you may be aware of the fact that the immigration crisis in Europe which started probably earlier than 2014 really, but came to a head 2015-16. Sweden was one of those countries, along with Germany and a few others, which were had the most kind of liberal policies in terms of making sure as many newcomers could be welcomed as possible, and trying to create a good living conditions for refugees when they came to Sweden. And that created its own challenges. I mean, we had a probably a short-term population increase of over 5% here in our county between 2015 and 2017. And what happened was at the very same time, then the government really needed to try and find quick ways to create what they kind of termed a meaningful stay, or a meaningful life, really, for people who are waiting for their asylum applications to be granted. So we found ourselves in a situation where there was lots of refugees and immigrants living in temporary accommodation, government-funded temporary accommodation, all over the county, both rurally and in urban areas. And I suppose government here has always seen, and I suppose the population at large has always seen sport as a motor for inclusion. I guess we see that across the world, that the cliche of football being a universal language. Now that's kind of problematic in itself, which I can touch on a little bit later. But really, it was seen as a quick way for our new arrivals and our newcomers to quickly try to establish themselves in the community here. So there was a deal brokered between the government and the National Sports Federation, where they said, okay, we're going to give you 64 million Swedish kroner, so about between 6 and 7 million euro yearly between 2015 and 2020. And we'd like you to use that to make sure that as many of our new arrivals as possible feel comfortable, feel like they've got a meaningful social activity that they can get involved with. So locally, what that meant for us in concrete terms was between 2016 and beginning of 2018, just over 70 of our clubs in our county of just over 200,000 people had applied for and been granted funding to try and create the conditions for some of our new Swedes to get involved in activities. For us, we were directly involved. We know that somewhere between 60 and 70% of all of our new arrivals were involved in activities with our clubs during that time period. What we're not counting in is clubs that didn't apply for funding. So where we could and where we had knowledge that there was good work going on, we were out looking to support those clubs and help them with costs, everything from like training gear and equipment to increased transport costs or money to rent sports halls or whatever it may be. That was what the funding was earmarked for, to make sure that the club didn't have to worry about money, but could really just say, yes, come, you're welcome here. So that kind of program period has finished, and there was kind of lots of learnings from it, which I'll touch on in a little while. But I guess the main thing was it put a real spotlight on Swedish sport in a way that it hadn't been done ever, really. And within Swedish sport, we kind of pride ourselves on our values and kind of our culture, where we kind of say that everybody is welcome no matter what. And it was a real test for those values to see, what do those values look like in reality now? Are we living up to what we're saying, what we have in our constitution? Because as I explained earlier, as this traditional democratic organization, we have that constitution and a very clear document on our vision and values and culture. So it really put all that to the test. And we really saw the kind of the goodness of these kind of voluntary coaches and volunteers that give so freely of their time during that period, where there was so many good stories. One of my first visits, I would be, and part of my work would be to visit the clubs and see how the reality looks on the grass or on the ice. And one of my first visits was to a small little football club far out in kind of a rural area. And just sitting down having Swedish fika, which is like a cinnamon bun and a cup of coffee in the evening, where everybody who had been involved in this club for like 15 years was just so happy because for the first time they could field like 2 football teams. So for them, this was really just fantastic, and you could see it just had given them new energy. So we saw loads of that, loads of fantastic stories and of people just traveling from these kind of temporary accommodations that I mentioned to sports clubs that generally were welcoming them with open arms. Another great story of a boy who had come alone from Afghanistan, had spent several weeks as a refugee across Europe and landed, and had a massive kind of love for wrestling, and had competed at quite a high level back home, and had found really himself a new home really quickly in his wrestling club. So just lots of good stories, but also lots of challenges, as you can imagine, which I'll come back to. As time has shifted, we've also shifted focus, partly because the country's immigration strategy has shifted, and plus we went from a very steep curve of new arrivals to a kind of a more gentle curve, and also the challenge of, okay, how can we now help these people establish a life here, not just short term, make them feel at home and make sure we're giving them good conditions to just get over that initial period, but rather, okay, how can we help these people build a meaningful life? And so we've seen a shift to a more urban focus, because we see that many of the people who've stayed and have been granted asylum have moved to cities, which has then again put the spotlight on us on kind of areas that are already underprivileged. And finally, kind of now we're focusing on these areas as our priority. So even our language has shifted over the last 5.5 years. So we've gone from talking about an establishment program, which is our first program at UC, Sport for New Swedes, very much an establishment bit of work, to know where we're talking about, okay, what areas are we prioritizing? We've even moved away from the language of exclusion and the language of social exclusion and underprivileged to, okay, what are we prioritizing? I like saying, when I'm out and I'm talking to people and we say, oh, they're underprivileged areas, or they're sports weak. I like to try and say that we in sport have been the weak ones, not to give the supports and create the conditions for sport to flourish in these areas. I think it's a much nicer way to describe it, and probably more accurate in many ways. As I said, feel free to stop and ask questions, or write them in the chat, and Sarah can give me a nudge. So what I'd summarize maybe from the period like 2015 to 2018 was that we learned lots. Like we really learned lots. On the right, you see we've had some core assumptions in our change process that we nationally, in terms of our inclusion policy, we want what we learn and how we learn to be empirical. We have a norm critical perspective, an intersectional perspective, and we kind of have an assumption that those with the privilege are also those with the power to change. And we've really worked on that. Like in our gender equality work, we talk about male decision makers making the right decision to create opportunities for their female colleagues. And same in this case, those who are already included and important and have power within a sports club or a regional federation or in the national federation to also create the conditions for those who don't have the same privileges to also get the power and influence needed. So there are kind of our core assumptions, like the platform that everything rests on. And then our learnings, as you can see on the left, is that we really saw that, as I said, it kind of put a spotlight on how good are we at this idea of making sure everybody can be involved. And we saw so clearly that anyone can be included on a short-term basis. I mean, if there was a little bit of money, and sometimes there wasn't funding to be there, but going to a football club or a tennis club or whatever it was, and saying, okay, can you create a program for 10 weeks? I mean, 9 times out of 10, that wasn't an issue. And it was a huge span of ages. We've seen in our own kind of studies that certainly girls were underrepresented in our statistics, and where the girls from also was a factor that determined their involvement. And sometimes individual sports were underrepresented as well. There was a majority majority of our participants in these 70 clubs that I mentioned earlier were kind of football and kind of popular team sports. Secondly, we saw just a huge gap in knowledge in terms of like intercultural understanding, understanding of discrimination and norms and values at a very basic level, where we were going out and we heard the conversations, and we heard and discussed the prejudices and the assumptions. So that we realized also through focus group work and through interviews and through qualitative analysis that really there was a massive knowledge gap. Thirdly, we saw that money helps. Again, in some of our studies, we saw that lots of these volunteer leaders, when they found out that they could get, we're not talking huge money relatively, but when they could get, 1,000 euros or 1,500 euros to buy in equipment so that they didn't have to worry about it, all of a sudden it made the whole project easier for them to kind of take on. But certainly not the whole solution, particularly when we look beyond the period of the project. So when we look long term, when we look towards sustainability, then we see this kind of interaction between this idea of kind of competency and also economic, the hard and the soft kind of interlinking and being important. Fourthly, we saw that like representation is everything. In urban areas where we have a young girl who has the relevant coach education, instantly we see that there will be more girls involved in the activities. If that girl then herself has an immigrant background, like as either first or second generation, then similarly she becomes automatically the role model for that group that we're trying to work with. And then like this has been us internally as an organization. It's been a massive journey where within the 70 unions, in terms of the power structures there, within Swedish Sports Confederation there, the key stakeholders and those with power and privilege there, I mean, we're predominantly a very, 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 very middle class white sport, where we see that, our white organization, where we see that education, post second level education, spending power and ethnicity are very dominant factors in determining who's going to be sitting on the board, and that's true for the local club right through to the top of the national organization. So we have a huge body of work to do there. And actually the group that was recruited during the period 2015 and 2016, including myself, in our 19 districts was probably the first time 19 people within Swedish sport that there was such a diversity of backgrounds within that group, which has been also a real, in terms of representation, a real kind of key success factor for us, even in terms of how we approach the work. And then like the last thing we've learned really clearly is that the traditional forms of our sport and the way it's organized tend to be inherently exclusionary. What I mean by that is that in Sweden, we're very good at organizing things. Like for example, my son is 9 and he's decided that he wants to join. He's played little different sports, and this summer he wanted to join a new football club. And I've had a conversation with the coach over the last few days, and we've got so much information for the last few days, down to the fact that there are no toilets beside the football pitch. Was the latest bit of information we got. So we're really good at organizing, and we have kind of tacit, inherent expectations on everybody that they get this, that it is so organized, that there are several layers and several steps you have to go through in order to just be a participant. And it's all taken for granted. And we see that similar to the idea of like socioeconomic background and educational background, a parent to a child, their own involvement in sport is also a really high predictor of whether their kids will be involved in sport or not, and also how long they'll take them. So all along the way, we've been trying to take these bits from studies we've been doing centrally, and then immediately try to transfer that knowledge and turn it into competence locally. So we've been, taking an idea like, okay, if if there's more kids with parents who've been involved in sport, what does that mean for this local club when they're trying to attract a group of kids who don't have parents with that background? So like my job has been really about trying to, okay, we get the problem, we understand some of the evidence behind it. So how do we impact that locally and quickly? In one study we did, where we held focus group interviews with just over 100 people here locally, which was very interesting, and it was evaluating the work over this period between 2015 and 2018, where, as I mentioned, up to 70% of everybody who had come as a refugee in our county of Värmland had at least been involved in trying out a sport. We asked the club's coaches, we asked the participants themselves, we asked parents, we asked non-sporting administrative volunteers, so the people who sit in the boards. We asked them like what's worked, what hasn't worked. And really it was so interesting because we had heard for so long that the biggest barrier to sustainability and the biggest barrier to inclusion were things like language, lack of finance or lack of money, lack of resources, cultural problems, like they don't come in, they're not coming to training on time. They're not coming to training on time was something we really heard quite often, actually. As well as being organized in Sweden, we also have very much like the clock. We've got a calendar culture, as we refer to, and like a lot of that. So, but actually, what we saw as one of the biggest barriers to inclusion was actually the norms around how the sport itself is organized. So this idea that to play football means to train 3 times a week and to play 20 league games a season, or to play tennis, it means to go to an instructor-led lesson twice a week and then get involved in the ladder competition, or to play ice hockey, this is what you need to be able to do on skates by this age, and so on and so on and so on. That there was a continuous experience of the newcomers feeling like they weren't good enough or they didn't understand the codes, and a parallel experience of coaches and leaders saying so they don't understand what we're about here. So it was really interesting that like the language and costs and all that were certainly contributing factors, but really how we look upon and how we organize training and competition structures was far more important than anybody would have thought. And like I said, it's rarely have we had a situation where the local ice hockey club would suddenly have 15 12-year-olds who wanted to get on the ice for the first time, or the local curling club suddenly had residents right beside them who had never seen curling and never seen a curling hall and had no idea what it was. Never the football club who had suddenly had 17 15-year-olds rock up to training when there's only 20 people in the club. These are the kind of situations that we had, and as I said, where the actual way we train and play and compete was almost just as important as the norms and values and cultures of the club. But again, I mean, most of the clubs did a fantastic job with meeting these challenges, but very well summed up by one coach in a meeting or in a focus group when they said, are we going to push them over the barriers, or are we going to lower the barriers? And for me, that became this emerged from a study we did with our local university, and for me this really became like the tagline of our work since 2019. It's like okay, how do we make these barriers visible, because they seem to be invisible, and when we've made them visible, how do we get rid of them? Sarah, should I keep going, or will we take a little pause if people want to grab a glass of water or a cup of tea or a coffee? In Sweden, we're really used to having our our breaks and our fika pauses.
I think
or shall we just
to keep going if you are.
Yeah, let's keep going then. Perfect. Is there a question? I see it's blinking in the chat there. Is there a question?
No, that was just me saying that you can just keep going. You don't need to take a break.
Okay, great. Perfect. Yeah, so here we were, like 2019, with this, and this thing was just like ringing around in my head. Like, what are these barriers? What are we talking about? You know, and why are so many of them invisible? And which really don't let us down this road of these unwritten, you know, norms as per definition are, you know, unwritten rules. But there was so many of them. You know, I remember my own experience coming here 2010 for entirely different reasons to the people that came here between 2015 and 18, and going down my local rugby, a small rugby club. It took me months to navigate the kind of this system that I outlined for you in the beginning, where we would elect, you know, our local board, and that is taken seriously, that kind of democratic responsibility. And then we would send our representative to the national annual general meeting for Swedish rugby, and then Swedish rugby would send their representatives to the national federation. And to see that in action was both, you know, fascinating, impressive, but also a little bit daunting. You know, where it was like, I just want to play rugby. And it's been the same experience for me as a parent. Thankfully, because I work here, I got the shortcuts and I have the relationships. But I have friends who don't have a Swedish background, and they'll come to me and they'll say, like, this happens often. They'll come to me and they'll say, oh, my daughter wants to do athletics, but I've looked on the website and I have no idea. Can you help me out? Or you know, recently we have quite often summer activities, which can be like a partnership between us, a club, and a city council. And again, I've had friends come to me that may not have Swedish as a first language, and they'll just come and they'll say, you got to help me kind of register my kid for this activity. And there's so much taken for granted. I mean, the beauty of kind of the Swedish social democratic system is that generally things work, and they work over a long period of time. But there's so much kind of tacit knowledge which is implied, during growing up here, that as a newcomer, you're really starting from scratch, and they then become those kind of high barriers to involvement. So for me, taking this idea of do we lower the barriers, do we continue to push people over them, was, as I said, central, and it raised kind of two key questions for us locally. It was like, how do we solve this problem when it's so complex, where everything from intercultural understanding to fees involved in membership, are part of a complex, dynamic system. And the second one was, what's a good outcome? And I still don't have the answer to that question. You know, we're trying to create kind of an equal or an equitable opportunity to get involved for everybody, but it's very difficult to know what a good outcome is. We've recently done some research around participation levels locally, where we see like quite a high average number of kids involved in organized club activities in our county. Probably around 65% of youth, so kids and youth between the ages of 7 and 20, are involved in some kind of activity, are registered. So yeah, just over 6 in every 10 kids, which is, I would say, it's high. I don't know, relatively it fits in with the kind of the national picture. But we have extreme differences locally. We have extreme differences locally in the distribution of that 65%, let's say. Also, the difference between boys and girls participation is very, very, very low. It's not even statistically significant. So in terms of gender equality, we're doing something right on an average. But when we look locally, we see two parts of the city where we see there's one area where it's got higher percentage of non-Swedish born kids or parents, lower economic capacity, and lower general average education level. Suddenly we see that 65% drop down to 30% in some cases. whereas a neighboring area which has high educational capital, high economic capital, high social capital, it jumps to 95% in other areas. So really this work we've been doing has really highlighted the fact that we've got a lot to do if we're going to try and create better and more equal outcomes, where we don't know what a good number is. Is it 95%? Is it 65%? It's certainly not 40%. But how do we even out the differences, and can we do that? Some of you are probably familiar with the picture below. It comes, I think, from the idea of creating equitable health systems, where really this idea, if we go back to that coach's comments about pushing them over the barriers, is really what we were doing in the short term with economic funding. We were saying in the first picture, we were saying to the clubs, 3 clubs beside each other, we were saying, or to 3 different groups of people, we were saying, okay, here's a box, here's a box, here's a box. Now stand here, you can see the game. And then we were, 10 weeks later, when the project was finished and the funding was gone, we were taking the boxes away again, and then we were back to square one, and then we got a new round of funding. And then we started to kind of figure out, like, okay, maybe this really kind of quite wealthy football club, so like the first person in the second picture, actually doesn't need funding at all. So we started to kind of discern between clubs that were doing genuine work and were really working towards inclusion, and clubs who were just like creating kind of a little bit of a sideshow. We've had this kind of classic situation here, which isn't uncommon, where a club would apply for funding and they would create something like, in an urban area, they would create something like football at, from 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. on a Friday night, with like the really good intention of contributing to social inclusion, getting kids off the street at a particular time. But really, if we problematize that picture, are we creating inclusion, or are we stigmatizing a certain group of people? Because what was the parallel to this Friday night football was that, but on Tuesday night and Thursday night and Saturday, is that when like Swedes play football, and then everyone else plays on Friday night. And a lot of those projects were getting funded initially, even by us, but also by city councils. And then we looked at the final, if we look at the final picture, and probably where we're trying to go with this is that, okay, what are these barriers, and how can we get them down? So this fencing, how can we change it from something that's solid and impenetrable to something that doesn't create a barrier? And that's kind of where we are right now in our work. So we've shifted the focus from solely the idea of equality and giving everyone the same, to being a little bit more discerning and asking some better questions, to right now trying to really understand, okay, if we can work with these clubs over time, we see that we're firstly making these barriers visible, and once they're visible, we're able to lower them, as that coach so wisely mentioned in their interview. And this is quite a simple representation and potentially an oversimplification, but we had a situation where there was exclusion, and then we've had this idea perhaps of the Friday night football, which is really just perhaps like a segregation within that club. And then we've even had a situation where, okay, we'll create a team, all the newcomers can go and play, and they're all part of the club, but really there's no social interaction, there's no intergroup relationship building. It's intra-group, and this group is here, and then we have the other group there, and at the moment this group is incorporated in the bigger group. Whereas what we want to go is to this idea of inclusion is about a dialogue between the norms of the new group, the norms of the group that's been there before, and this kind of negotiation, this intercultural understanding. And I don't mean just cultural from a purely like an ethnicity perspective, but rather the group culture. What are our unwritten norms, and how can we create something new that's better and stronger and more diverse, so that we're rather like expanding the circle where our norms become our limits, so like our city limits, that we expand those, and all of a sudden naturally more people will feel like they've got space in there. So that's kind of what we want to do. So yeah, I've written, look, dialogue, more dialogue, and some competence and capacity building. That's where we are at the moment. So one of our, interestingly, I think it's quite unique, maybe there's something similar in Germany, but interestingly, we actually get state funding in our organization just for going to a club and having a conversation with 3 people, 3 or more. And we've got to have an intention with the conversation. There's got to be some co-learning involved, but we'll get a small sum of money for that hour that we're with them, which we can then support the club with financially to do different things. So we have enormous potential within our organizations to find these kind of key clubs and key partners to work with over time, and really go towards that idea of being long-term focused and sustainable. I'm aware of time here, so look, some of these barriers that I've mentioned in another study we've seen lower down, we see that there is lack of clubs and activities in underprivileged areas. We see limitations and worse conditions for girls. This idea of the norms within our training and competition system, that it sets unrealistic and over-ambitious sporting demands on our youth and beginners. It's unrealistic and over-ambitious. So if you're 13 years old, chances right now here that you want to start playing football or ice hockey or a team sport without prior experience and getting to do that are quite low. Also, what I mentioned earlier, difficulties finding and registering for activities. There's a lack of stability. We have a high turnover of coaches, for example. We have also problems with racism, discrimination, and abuse. And then we have a real lack of cooperation sometimes and resources. So these are some of the challenges that we're working with now. So what we're trying to do is we try to bridge the gap between people who and groups that are excluded and the in-group or the existing core of the club or environment. And I try to talk about these hard and soft barriers. Hard ones are the easy ones, the ones that go quickly. Okay, we need money because we need to do this. There's funding available, let's grant it. Soft barriers, okay, we've got problems with attitudes and norms in the club. How do we work? So, and I want to finish up by just sharing a couple of our practical tools that we would use. And as I'm going through the practical tools, maybe it's worth just reflecting on your own environment and see what pops up for you, what thoughts come into your head, what kind of analysis is starting to emerge as you hear. This is one of the things that we would talk with a club or a number of clubs or a sport. Like, for example, we potentially could gather, several tennis clubs in our county, and then we ask them to go and start making visible how things look. We're asking them, what do you see in your club? What do you hear in your club? What do you feel in your club? And then we look at these as different arenas. So we go from the training and the practice sessions to the locker room. We talk about the boardroom, the competition arena, and in the crowd. And we ask them to work on these questions. We ask them to say what you see and who do you see. We ask them to describe what they feel, and we ask what they hear. And in a deep process, we'll involve several different groups within the club in this work. Everyone from the younger kids to the older kind of volunteers who have been there for the whole time. And we start to see kind of a picture emerging. So for example, if we're in the locker room, we're asking who's here, what do they look like? So how old are they, what gender, how do they identify themselves, what do they look like, who fits in, what are the norms? So we're not talking about norms, we're trying to make it really easy where it's just a descriptive, qualitative work. We're asking about power. So who's talking at meetings, who's deciding things. We're asking them to start thinking about what can be considered, limiting to some people. Does everyone here come live in the same area? Do their parents have the same kind of jobs? Have they gone to the same kind of schools? So we're asking them some difficult questions, and we'll do this. We'll try to create lots of safety in the group. It'll be a process where we'll facilitate this over a couple of hours and potentially a couple of sessions. And then this is another tool we would use. We've looked at some of those barriers, those soft barriers I've mentioned, where cost, gender inequality, parents own like capital in terms of having a sports background or having certain education. We've also looked at this idea of too high demands on beginners. And so this is just one example of some of the work we could do. We list these statements, and then we can have a whole host of people within the organization answer as to how well this statement applies to me. So if I've never had to think about how I can make my way to training or a game, i.e. I've always had a parent who can give me a lift, or I can afford to take myself there and I can find my way, then I have privilege. And if all these statements are highly applicable to me, then I've got quite a lot of privilege. And then we'll lead the club on this journey of understanding. But okay, if all of you have all of this privilege, and you're saying everybody's welcome at yours, is that really the case? And it's tempting for us to go in on day one and say, okay, right now we think there's too many dudes in here, or there's not enough people with non-white appearance, or whatever it is. We'll build up that safety with the group over a period of time, and then we'll start to slowly get them to realize, okay, when we say we want to grow, when we say we're welcome for everyone, what we really mean is that we want more people who look like us. And when we can't find more people who look like us, then we say we can't grow, or we've got a lack of coaches, or we've got a lack of parents, because we don't know. What we'll find then is we'll help them to also understand that they don't know even how to ask the question or to find the people who could help with the kind of the diversity of the environment, and that we really help them to understand that diversity will really enrich your environment. You'll have all sorts of people around who can be a coach or an administrator, or more kids who can enjoy your sport or enjoy your game. So these are kind of just some of the examples on the work we do. So it's really this, as I said, it's really this kind of informed, norm critical perspective where we'll look at what discrimination is, and we'll work through some education issues around that. We'll also have an intersectional perspective, and then really this kind of relationship building that we want to do this work with them over time. So I've been working, for example, with a football club locally for just over a year now. We've got to the point where they're ready to appoint like a diversity officer within the club, and we probably won't call it the diversity officer within the club, but rather something around growth or membership, because that's ultimately what it's about. And we'll see that person will be laser focused on these barriers, like the economic barriers, like the norms around their club, their clubhouse, their training facilities, their boardroom, and that this parallel process of kind of education and then capacity building within the club will hopefully create more inclusive environments. We see that when we do that, and when we lead the work, or when we've been actively involved, we see that the diversity of groups that have been involved in clubs activities is probably 20%. When we take girls, for example, it's probably 20% more girls involved in activities when we've been involved, and we've delivered workshops, or we've done education with clubs who haven't done that kind of work and have organized similar activities, for example, like a summer school. If we haven't been there and talked about these issues, then this club who'll do a summer school will have a membership or a group of participants that will pretty much look like they've always looked. If we've done some work, then 20% more. If we've specifically talked about gender equality, and perhaps from an intersectional perspective with ethnicity, we see 20% more girls with a background, first or second generation of immigration involved in the same activity. So we see that we can make a difference, but it takes time and patience. I have a little video, a little film clip that I can finish up on. If we were to kind of visualize the future where these barriers are lowered, and we see this kind of relationship building and trust with kind of local role models in an urban environment, this is potentially what it would look like. So I'll finish up on this. This is not locally here in Värmland. It's a little bit further down south, but it's a lovely example of a kind of a long-term work on the needs of the people who you want to include.
Min historia är att jag kom till Sverige med min mamma och mina syskon. Och min pappa hade gått bort i Kosovo sen innan. Och min mammas första sak var att gå ut och lära dig språket liksom. Ut och integrera dig, hitta vänner. Men det var svårt för jag förstår ingenting och det var svårt att få liksom kontakt med andra. Till en början var det allt. Alltså jag ville inte ens gå på dansklasserna, utan bara umgås. Träffa danstränarna, träffa andra från andra områden som samlades. För att det fanns ju just inte många fritidsgårdar, mötesplatser för ungdomar. Men sen bara, detta tycker jag är jätteroligt. Så de dansade och bara, wow, jag vill också bli som dem. Och nu har jag egen klass liksom. Så det är jättehäftigt.
Det här är ju ett av Malmös mest utsatta områden. Det har varit, de senaste 2 åren så har det varit skjutningar runt omkring torget som så att säga har drabbat hela området. Vi måste se till att de som idag är 11-12 år, att de inte hamnar ute på gatan utan att de blir föreningsanknutna, att de får en annan trygghet att gå till.
Hela Malmö är en organisation som på olika sätt försöker se till så att barn och ungas rättigheter tillgodoses. Allting bygger på var befinner sig barn och unga. Alltså vad har de för önskemål och vad har de för behov. Och det är olika. Så pratar man om man skapar relationer med barn så identifierar man, de kanske uttrycker, ja men jag vill spela fotboll eller jag vill spela dataspel, låt säga. Men sen kan vi också säga att det finns behov som inte uttrycks. Låt säga att behov av vuxna människor runt omkring sig, behov av trygga rum, behov av frukost på morgnarna. Vi bygger upp verksamheten genom att bestå av ungdomar, lyssna till barn och unga, liksom inkludera dem i processerna på ett så demokratiskt och inkluderande sätt som möjligt. Så detta är våra lokaler. Vi har 16 rum. 1000 kvadratmeter. Dansen här inne är den enda som är igång. Här är bibliotek, där är kiosk, shop, café. Där inne kommer vi ha ett stort gamingrum. Här tror vi att vi kommer ha en så kallad fritidsbank. Så att tanken här är också att detta är en plats man hänger men också ut och leka i området. Idrottsrörelsen i alla led, förutom bland utövarna, utgörs av människor som inte bor i de här områdena. Så ser vi också att det är väldigt vitt, det är väldigt gubbigt i toppen och det är väldigt vuxet. En av idrottens uppgifter, det är ju på något sätt att implementera eller inspirera till liksom demokratiskt tänkande. Men hur i praktiken så är det ju, jag tror det är någon galen procent, typ 5%. Som är under 25 i svenska idrottsföreningars styrelser. Så att barn och unga är per definition exkluderade ur bestämmande funktioner inom idrotten.
Demokratin blir på en annan nivå också, där man kanske inte alltid ska ha de här omröstningarna eller årsmötena, utan besluten sker ute på verksamheten.
Men om vi vände på det, hängde på skolan, skapade relationer, tog reda på vad vill ni göra. Då plötsligt så var det inte vi som bestämde. Så vi kom ut som basketspelare, men det blev plötsligt att vi skulle ha disco, vi skulle ha liksom killerball eller vad det nu må vara. Men det var just det att då, när vi vände på det och de fick bestämma och de kände ett ägandeskap, då fick vi med 22 av 25 istället för 7 av 25. Om man inte har en egen agenda, om jag inte har, jag vill skapa den nästa Zlatan, det är det enda jag är intresserad av. För oss i alla fall så handlar det om att vi skiter i det. Vi vill ha liksom en stor social verksamhet, så många som möjligt som är med på tåget, så många som möjligt som hittar ett tryggt rum. I synnerhet i områden som inte kanske alltid är så trygga.
Det handlar väldigt mycket om värdegrund och det handlar...
I think I'll pause it there. It's just a little bit of repetition towards the end, Sarah, and I'm aware of time, if we want to have time for a question or two. But that's all from me. Just thanks for the opportunity, Sarah, to come and meet you guys today and tell you a little bit more about the work we're doing and some of the stuff that works and some of the stuff that we have left to do. So thanks.
Thank you. I mean, I see you on a regular basis, and I found it really interesting too.
Okay.
We do have one question from Marianne. It's
Right.
How do you handle situations when coaches and or club members are not welcoming towards new members with a different cultural background due to language barriers, racist attitudes, etc.?
It's a really good question. I think like I've learned through these 5.5 years that initially I would like to have just like called up that coach and be like, what are you doing? But I've really learned to just try and like the tolerance works both ways. And like that can be maybe a little bit of a like provocative idea, but if we assume that the person is coming from a place of ignorance rather than hate, then we can also maybe think that we can get a little bit further by helping them understand. So that's kind of my own kind of personal view. Professionally, what we would do is when we get in some information like that, we would contact the club and we would offer that we come out and we do a session with them for a couple of hours on norms and values, and hope that it makes a difference. And then we obviously have kind of a whistleblowing function within Swedish sport, so that if we felt it was an issue of racism or hate, then we have kind of procedures in place to deal with it that way as well. So education and dialogue, and failing that, if it was a potential problem, then there's a whistleblowing way, and also obviously the legal route if the person was discriminated against as well. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you. We also have from Daniel Eger, even though it's great that a lot of children are participating in organized sport, in my experience, at least in Germany, a lot of children stop playing in a club once they move away to go to uni. Are there any practices or programs that helps this re-inclusions for non-children, or are there any statistics? That was a long question, hope you got.
Yeah, good question. Again, good question. The statistic that jumps to mind for me, Daniel, is that right now our participation levels for boys and girls peaks at 11 years of age. So it's a huge problem for us here as well as it is for you guys in Germany. From a national perspective, there are some initiatives happening. And in broad terms, we're trying to go from like a traditional triangle perspective where you need a broad grassroots to create an elite, and there's a natural drop off every year, where we're trying to encourage sports to develop new concepts which will be attractive for people to continue with, even if they don't want to be competing. So for me, it's a little bit around like a competition question.
Thank you. If anyone has any more questions, then now is your time.
Speak now.
Yes.
Otherwise, you can always mail Sora if you want to reach out. I'm happy to answer questions or have a chat, so no worries.
Yes, feel free to do that. And thank you to everyone for joining. Than says thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
So I will stop recording now.